They laughed at the delivery guy until he became their boss. They laughed at the delivery guy, mocked him at every opportunity, smirked when he passed by, and whispered jokes behind his back, until the day he became their boss and handed them their termination papers. For over a decade, Julian Carter had made deliveries throughout downtown Denver. He knew every alley, every service elevator, and every back entrance in the high-rise towers that lined 17th Street. He had memorized the names of the receptionists who barely made eye contact as they signed for packages. He knew which buildings were quickest at 9 a.m. and which ones slowed him down during the lunch rush. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. It paid the bills, and Julian took pride in doing it well. Most people saw him as just another uniform, a man pushing a dolly loaded with cardboard boxes, blending into the background. Someone unimportant, someone who didn't matter. At Westbridge and Holt, a prestigious marketing firm housed in a sleek glass tower with marble floors and panoramic city views, that attitude was especially strong. They had a reputation for being one of the most cutthroat firms in the industry, and the employees wore their arrogance like designer labels. The first time Julian stepped through their towering glass doors, it was supposed to be just another delivery. But he noticed it immediately. The glances, the way they dismissed him as soon as he entered. The receptionist, a woman named Megan who wore sharp blazers and expensive heels, barely glanced up as she scribbled her signature on the tablet he held out. She was already focused on something, or someone, she deemed more important. Julian told himself it didn't matter. He had seen this kind of thing before. But at Westbridge and Holt, it was different. Over time, he started noticing more. The smirks, the chuckles when he passed by with a package in hand, the quiet snickers that always seemed to follow him down the hall. He ignored them. At least, he tried to. One afternoon, as Julian placed a parcel on the front counter, he heard it, clear as day. "Man, can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" someone said, snickering. The laughter that followed was loud enough to draw a glance from Megan, who smirked but said nothing. Julian didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He recognized the voice. Ethan Reynolds, senior account executive. Expensive suits, perfect hair, and a laugh that was always a little too loud. He was the kind of man who thrived in places like Westbridge and Holt. Confident, cocky, convinced of his own superiority. A second voice joined in, this time a woman's. "Please." He's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading board meetings. More laughter. Julian's hand tightened on the tablet. He handed it over to Megan to sign, careful to keep his face neutral. He had dealt with worse. He had spent years learning to brush off that kind of talk. But this was different. It wasn't just the words, it was the certainty behind them. The absolute belief that a man like him could never sit at the head of a table, never sign paychecks, never hold power. As Julian turned toward the exit, passing rows of glass-walled offices where employees sipped lattes and scrolled on their phones pretending to work, he caught his reflection in the polished surface of the glass doors. His uniform, the worn scanner clipped to his belt, his rough hands from years of lifting heavy boxes. To them, that was all he was. That was all he could ever be. For the first time in a long time, that bothered him. Outside, the Colorado sun was bright, but it offered no warmth. Julian climbed into his van and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. Anger was fleeting. This was something deeper, something colder, something sharper. They thought they knew who he was. They had no idea, but they were going to find out. Julian Carter had always been the kind of man who kept his head down and worked hard. He had been ignored, dismissed, talked down to for most of his life. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising anymore. But that moment at Westbridge and Holt, that laughter, had dug under his skin in a way he couldn't shake. That night, after finishing his deliveries, Julian parked his van in front of his small apartment in Aurora. It wasn't much. One bedroom, old carpeting, a tiny kitchen with creaky cabinets. But it was his. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the cracked sidewalk illuminated by a flickering street lamp. For years, he had told himself it didn't matter what people thought of him. As long as he worked hard and made an honest living, that was enough. But tonight, that belief wasn't holding up. Their laughter wasn't born from ignorance. It came from certainty. Certainty that he would never be anything more than a delivery guy. He needed to talk to someone. Someone who understood. He pulled out his phone and called his older sister, Simone. She picked up after 2 rings. Hey, Jules. You good? He hesitated. Yeah, just one of those days. Simone didn't rush him. She never did. Let me guess, she said softly. Some folks made you feel like you don't belong. Julian let out a long breath. Something like that. He told her about what had happened at Westbridge and Holt. About the laughter. The jokes. When he finished, Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. Good. He blinked. Good. It means you're tired of it, Simone said. And when you get tired, you move. You make things happen. Julian leaned back against the headrest, staring up at the cracked ceiling of his van. What am I supposed to do, Simone? Quit. Just because a bunch of suits don't respect me. No. You're smarter than them. Smarter than you give yourself credit for. Her words stuck with him. Julian had always been good with numbers. Good with strategy. When he was 17, he turned $500 into a few thousand flipping vintage sneakers. Later, he got into buying and selling used cars. He understood markets, investments, and risk management. He just hadn't gone all in. Not yet. Dad used to say, Simone continued. When people only see you one way, you've got two choices. Prove them right, or prove them wrong. Julian closed his eyes. Yeah, I remember. So what's it gonna be? Julian spent the next year proving them wrong. While they sat in their glass offices thinking they had the world figured out, he worked. Days were spent making deliveries. Evenings were for studying, investing, learning. Late nights were for video calls with potential partners, crunching numbers, reviewing contracts. He didn't waste time talking about his plans. He didn't tell people what he was working toward. He just moved. Quietly. Relentlessly. Julian had always been good at spotting opportunities other people missed. That's how he had turned a side hustle into serious money. But this was different. This was big. He had developed a business proposal. A plan to acquire a struggling company, restructure it, and make it profitable again. And he had the attention of people who mattered, investors who cared more about his numbers than his job title. One evening, Julian met with one of them in a private lounge at the Four Seasons downtown. Nathan Ellis was a venture capitalist with a reputation for backing winners and a talent for spotting talent others overlooked. So, Nathan said, sipping a neat scotch, why Westbridge and Holt? Julian leaned forward. Because they're in trouble, and they don't even know it yet. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Explain. They've been bleeding clients for over a year, Julian said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Bad leadership. Outdated strategies. Reckless spending. They still look successful on the outside, but underneath? They're drowning. Nathan flipped through the pages, his expression sharpening. You're sure? Julian nodded. I've been watching them. They've lost 3 of their biggest accounts. Retention's tanking. They're clinging to their reputation, but it's not enough. And you want to buy them. I don't just want to buy them, Julian said. I want to turn them around. Strip out the dead weight. Bring in fresh talent. Make them a leader again. Nathan studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and slid a check across the table. Julian stared at it. It was the exact amount he needed to make his first move. You've got my backing, Nathan said. Don't make me regret it. It took months of careful maneuvering. Westbridge and Holt wasn't public, but it had multiple private shareholders. Julian approached them one by one. Some were skeptical, but money talked. So did numbers. By the time the paperwork was finalized, Julian Carter held the controlling interest in Westbridge and Holt. The final step was informing the man at the top. Thomas Whitaker, the firm's longtime CEO, had built his career on privilege and connections. He had no idea the walls were closing in. Julian scheduled a meeting. No pretense. No warning. When he walked into the office that morning, everything had changed. The receptionist who used to barely glance at him sat up straighter as he entered. The employees who used to chuckle when he passed whispered among themselves now. When Julian stepped into Whitaker's office, the CEO barely looked up. What's this about? Whitaker asked, annoyed. Julian set an envelope on his desk. As of this morning, I own the majority of Westbridge and Holt. Whitaker stared at him for a moment before chuckling. You? That's ridiculous. Check the paperwork, Julian said calmly. Whitaker did. The color drained from his face. This can't be right, he muttered. It is, Julian said. You've got until the end of the day to clear out your office. Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. He was speechless. Julian turned to leave, but glanced back over his shoulder. Don't worry, Thomas. I hear there's an opening at the delivery company. The conference room was packed 10 minutes later. Julian stood at the front, facing the employees who had once dismissed him. Some looked confused. Others looked panicked. Ethan Reynolds stood near the back, arms crossed, smirking. "This a joke?" he asked. Julian met his gaze. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He laid out the facts. The numbers. The ownership documents. Silence stretched as the reality sank in. "I've watched this company fall apart from the inside," Julian said. "Now we're rebuilding. Some of you will stay. Some of you won't." There was a pause. "Anyone who's not ready for change," he continued. "There's the door." Ethan scoffed. "You're making a mistake." "The mistake was underestimating me," Julian replied. By the end of the day, termination letters were issued. Ethan Reynolds handed in his resignation with a sneer. Julian accepted it with a nod. In the weeks that followed, Westbridge and Holt changed. Some employees left. Others stepped up. Julian promoted people who had been overlooked, junior staff with ideas and passion. He brought in new talent, restructured departments, and implemented fresh strategies. The clients who had left? Some returned. The company that was once sinking found its footing. And Julian Carter? He stood at the helm. No longer just the delivery guy. He was the boss. And he wasn't just proving them wrong anymore. He was leading them forward. The lesson? Never underestimate someone because of where they start. Because one day, they might be the one signing your paycheck.